Do you listen to your podcasts with Stitcher? Well, many people like to, and now Notebook on Cities and Culture is available on it. Find out more about what Stitcher is and does at Stitcher.com. It's a smartphone app. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Anybody reading your book might think that you spend a lot of time, a lot of your daily life considering reality in terms of microorganisms. Would they be right?
At a certain point in my life, especially when I got sick, I began to think a little bit more about, well, when I got sick and I didn't get better for a long time, that was a problem. I began to get interested to find out what was going on inside of me and why. I mean, chronic ulcerative colitis is a disease that most doctors don't understand. Well, in fact, everyone thinks it's kind of genetic or it's the body turning against itself for no reason. But of course, in all diseases of the autoimmune system and defenses, bacteria are involved, and that's a new kind of frontier in medicine and science. So there was a lot of new advances in the field. All the human genome project and the human microbiome project were kind of revealing new things about bacteria, which helped me understand myself and everything. But of course, I have a long-standing kind of like gringo paranoia, parasites, and I've gotten sick here so many times that I kind of put the two worlds together, my actual experience eating out and getting sick and having the bad shits all the time, and the world of modern medicine that's only now understanding a bit of what's going on inside of a large intestine and other places. So, and especially for writing the book, I mean, I started researching and thinking about what's going on, and so you could say I was obsessed, and in fact it became kind of a ruling metaphor for how I view the world. A lot of human activity is based on, or is an outgrowth of the parasites we have inside of us and of the bacteria we have inside of us. So a lot of our behavioral and social patterns can be seen as bacterial or parasitic in style.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in Colonia, Condesa in Mexico City with Kurt Hollander, author of Several Ways to Die in Mexico City, subtitled an autobiography, and that bio bit is even more important, as you'll realize as soon as you open the book than in most autobiographies. He's also been a publisher, a filmmaker. He's run a bar here. He's lived in Mexico City for well over 2 decades, and he has much to tell about the place in this book, and in other forms, in photography as well, because he's also a photographer. Now, there are so many angles you can talk about Mexico City. There's the biological one, of course, but there's also the way that death seems to be an urban preoccupation here. Would you call it that? Is that an appropriate term, or a cultural preoccupation? Death.
Yeah, I think people everywhere are kind of concerned about their own mortality and stuff. And Mexico has a reputation of being a death culture. A lot of that, of course, is just kind of tourist promotion and
sugar skulls and whatnot.
Exactly. I mean, Day of the Dead was a created event by Diego Rivera and his gang, and it was basically a government kind of promotion of death as like the thing that binds the nation together, that everyone is concerned. But ultimately, everywhere people are concerned with their own mortality and stuff. What you see more in Mexico than, say, New York or Los Angeles, although there are places there where you see it too, is death is very present. People here die in ways that, and for reasons that in certain developed nations, people aren't dying anymore. So when you travel around the city, there are things that are a little more dangerous. I mean, when I was, I think like 17 years ago or something, I had an exhibition of photographs called Several Ways to Die in Mexico City.
Yes.
But it was like a kind of a funny gringo, it was kind of a funny take on gringo paranoia, but they had things like open manhole covers and like poles on the street and electric sockets. I mean, they were not the way that people really die, but they were just kind of ways that people could die. So, I mean, in one sense, you see kind of more obvious ways of dying, but in another, because it's a developing nation, you still have, or up until recently, you still had real heavy industry concentrated within the center of the city. And that affected people's health and the way they died in ways. I mean, New York hasn't been an industrial city for over 20, 30, 40 years. And therefore, the environment is no longer a major factor in the way people die there, or as much, at least in terms of pollution.
What are the striking ways people die here in Mexico City, or that would be striking to an outsider? Perhaps they're normal here, but for somebody who hasn't been in Mexico City since 1989, what seems odd about the way people die here?
Well, it's very interesting. Since '89, a little bit earlier, but over the past few decades, there's been a real shift. In Mexico, like in most of the world throughout history, people died of mostly natural causes being parasites. Most people died through diarrhea and through gastrointestinal diseases throughout the history of the world. And this was the case still in Mexico up until like 4 or 5 decades ago. And then what happens over the last few decades is, as Mexico shifts with the free trade agreement and as it becomes part of the global kind of economy, you see a direct shift in the way people die, where now they die in developed world deaths, which are heart diseases, liver disease, circulatory diseases, cancer, and these are all relatively new diseases. The problem in Mexico is in a lot of poorer working class neighborhoods, you have a combination of two. The diet has shifted so much that 50% of food eaten in Mexico is imported from the United States. And of course, it's the industrial process. It's the worst kind of food you could get from the U.S. So that's killing people here. At the same time as they still suffer from bad water and parasites in street food and all that. So they're really getting hit from both sides now.
How much is Mexico City now, the one we're sitting here in 2013, how much is it the same city you moved to and so quickly embraced in 1989?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, with the free trade agreement, there has been a real shift in diet, in consumption of everything, of alcohol, of entertainment,
general bloat, metaphorically.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an imposition of U.S. and global culture, which has completely changed the cultural life here in Mexico, and TV, movies, I mean, everything. But what I liked so much when I first came here is that Mexico had a working class culture that stretched back, you could say, thousands of years. It was people in certain communities that had existed before the Spanish arrived, that continued in terms of their markets, in terms of their kind of social interaction, in terms of making their own music. And what's happened is those communities have been broken and opened up to U.S. exports of culture, but also of products. So, like New York, when I left because it just seemed like New York was no longer a producer. It was a consumer, and it was a consumer of none of its own culture, which it had been for hundreds of years of immigrant culture. It was now a consumer of mainland U.S. culture. So culturally, Mexico, the shift has been incredibly rapid and profound. And on every level, it hasn't reached every community yet, but there are certain neighborhoods like here in the Condesa in the center that are kind of like, I call them the avant-garde. They are avant-garde of kind of global corporate kind of intrusion where it spreads from there throughout the city.
They're the avant-garde of something you'd rather not experience yourself.
Exactly. I mean, it seemed kind of cool, the earliest kind of things coming down. I mean, what was great about Mexico, it was, like I said, its own culture, but also a culture that had a lot more to do, well, in certain ways with Latin America. Of course, it always looked to the States and to Europe, but it had a kind of political consciousness with Latin America, and it had a shared history of colonialism and everything. Now it really, because it can get, I mean, Mexico City is a huge, very advanced city. So on the one hand, you would think it has its own culture, but on the other hand, like every city, small city throughout the United States, it consumes the same culture, and cities throughout the world now are become global. So it's become part of a much larger network that has very little to do with its own history.
As someone who grew up in America, you see these facets of American culture, these elements of American culture you find undesirable start to make themselves known here. And I wonder, there's a sense in which you don't want to have much to do with those, but is there also some kind of tension where somebody from Mexico might say, well, maybe we want to try these elements of American culture and see what they're like. Like, something where you might say, no, you don't want those, trust me. But like, well, maybe we want to decide for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, we're sitting in a cafe that has the lemongrass chai or something. It's not owned by a corporation. It's not a huge kind of chain of stores. It's somebody who I guess likes Indian culture or something. And I mean, yoga is a newcomer to the neighborhood the last 10 years or something. And yoga is fine, of course it helps the soul and all that, but like in the United States, it's become a real industry that has nothing to do with spiritual gains, but it's a bodily thing, and it's a reshaping of the bodies here as it is a reshaping of the culture. So there are positive benefits of having global culture, and there's also kind of negative because it downplays the local culture. There are lots of people, lots of Americans coming down now who are excited about Mexico City. Mexico City is an amazing city. Everyone who comes down here leaves really, unless they get really sick, they leave really kind of excited.
Right.
But a lot of the kind of excitement now is that they could come down and feel like they're at home and go to Starbucks and live the same kind of life as they do there.
Which is odd, because when you came here in '89, Mexico City offered you a completely different life, didn't it? That was the appeal. This is not where I came from. I mean, what experiences were very much, this is not where I'm from, and this is where I need to exist.
Well, it's interesting. It was completely different, and the difference lay mostly in its history. It's got an indigenous history of thousands of years, and it still persisted in certain ways. And it still had a working class Mexico City culture, which is long. So, I mean, it had its own films shown in its own movie theaters, and a lot of the culture, especially the high culture, was based on European kind of models instead of American models. So a lot of people come here, like, the difference that they see is because it's European and not American. But one of the interesting things is there was a lot that was in common with, I mean, when I came of age, I moved to the Lower East Side, and I lived always in Puerto Rican neighborhoods. In Puerto Rican neighborhoods, I mean, you got the corner store, you got the videos from the community, you got the local movie theater, you got music from there and all that. So that was, I mean, Mexico was like it's funny, Lower East Side is a single neighborhood, it's a barrio, but Mexico City was a whole giant city. There was a whole barrio that had its own, and of course millions, thousands of variations of the same thing. So, I mean, for me, community, which is barrio, which is a neighborhood, a strong kind of neighborhood with its, I mean, that's what Lower East Side was. It had its own gangs, it had its own kind of language, it had its own history. And that's what Mexico City had for a long time, and that's precisely what's being kind of destroyed with the globalization. But it is still what provides the greatest resistance to globalization and provides the greatest source of local culture.
Did it matter in those early years, or when you first arrived, did it matter that you were an outsider, or were there elements of your experience that made you into somehow less of an outsider because you had lived in the Lower East Side when it was the Puerto Rican Lower East Side, you know?
Yeah, I would like to. I mean, I had traveled to the Dominican Republic and to Puerto Rico before, and so I had some contact. New York, of course, is much more Caribbean than it was Mexican. The Mexican immigration started like 15, 20 years ago. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you do New York right, which I felt that I did, you could really travel to major cities anywhere and you kind of understand how things work. And that's what it kind of felt like. I felt kind of perfectly at home here on the streets, late at night, going anywhere. But that's the thing. I mean, Mexico City is just such a huge city with such an amazing culture that no barrio in the United States can compete with that. So I had a taste of it, but this was really an education. I really got to see what another culture and what another city can be.
What did it mean to you to do New York right?
Well, in part through the magazine that I edited called The Portable Side, I was able to have contact with all different communities within a single neighborhood. So, I mean, I met musicians, writers, filmmakers, sociologists, intellectuals, all different types of within the Polish community, the Dominican community, the Haitian community, the Chinese. I mean, I really kind of used, through the magazine, but also through my own interest, I used New York City as a kind of as a global, but I mean in a very different way. As the term multicultural didn't exist when my magazine started, and it has different connotations. Mine was not multicultural just because they're people from other places, but people in a single place sharing a kind of oppositional history of immigration and creating their own culture and living as foreigners and a thing. I mean, Lower East Side was an amazingly rich cultural place. And Mexico, although it's kind of a monoculture, well, comparatively, mostly Mexicans live here, there's an incredible variety because there's, I don't know, half of the city is Mexicans who've come from out of the city from all different places, and each region in Mexico has its own history and culture. And of course, there's been waves of immigration from European Jews to Argentinians, others from the Southern Cone and Central America and Europe. So, I mean, there's a big cultural mix here, too.
Now, I live in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is a place that I want to live because of how multicultural it is. How I go many a day I go with only speaking Korean or Spanish when I'm out on the streets. It wasn't like that, of course, before around the 1970s. Los Angeles was not diverse at all in the first half of the 20th century. And then before that, before it became American, you have a whole different story. But, in that period when it became an American city, it went through a long time of relative undiversity. Not the time I would have wanted to live in Los Angeles. I'm glad to live there in the time after, as a certain writer put it, the world moved in. In Mexico City, I mean, what's the difference between the world moving and making someplace interesting and foreign cultures coming in and making a place less interesting, as you seem to see happening in Mexico City? Is it because it's in the form of American corporations for the most part, or how do you see it?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, I mean, I don't know Los Angeles well, but I went there just before I came down here. And the history of Los Angeles is the history of Mexico. I mean, California is ex-Mex, and the Mexican culture there is the basis of the city. So I got to see, when I went downtown to the Mexican market and bought Mexican movies and Mexican magazines when I was in LA, that was a good taste of what's to come, because LA is a lot more like Mexico City in the urban, the suburban sprawl and the presence of Mexicans. I don't know. I think it's fundamental to distinguish between groups of people coming to a city. When you have immigrants who come for political reasons, such as the Spanish Republicans who came during the Civil War, or the Argentinians, Chileans, and Brazilians and Uruguayans who came during the dirty wars of the 70s and stuff, those were some privileged cultural immigrations, but it was a forced immigration, and these were oppositional groups. Oppositional groups mean that there's a kind of political consciousness and activity that's proper to their own city and stuff. In New York, of course, all the immigrant groups that passed through the Lower East Side were all the poorest, working class, and they were anarchists, they were socialists, Trotskyites, everything. And in Mexico, you've had that too because of the decimation of the countryside. All the Mexicans that moved to the city over the last 40 years have been the poorer, working class, many with indigenous roots and all that. Then you have kind of privileged immigrations, like the Argentinian immigration of the 90s or 2000s here actually, who were all these models, like, who came here to get work because the economy had died there. You know, they're cool, they're tall, they're good looking, they have tattoos, but they didn't bring any real culture. They just took jobs in the publicity world and all that. And then, I mean, the hipster kind of immigration that's going all over the world, that kind of transformed Prague and Berlin and all these others. I mean, what do they bring? To me, that's the most problematic kind of immigration, where it's college kids with a budget, traveling en masse and recreating kind of ideas that they have of their own kind of point of origin. So, I mean, there's fundamental differences in immigrants and kind of tourists. Tourism, of course, being the most harmful kind of movements across the globe.
Right at this moment, I mean, who do you see? Who are the new faces on the street? Who's coming right now? Do you have a sense of that, or does it take some time before you realize who it is who's been showing up here?
There's obviously a mix, but in this neighborhood, you just see so many people speaking English, and they're younger white kids from mid-America who are either doing a year abroad or there's also a lot of corporate kind of employment and even Latin Americans. I mean, Brazilians, there's all these like upper class Brazilians who come here, and Colombians who come here to work for the corporations here. I mean, Mexican economy is doing rather well, and especially in the corporate sector. So, I mean, that brings. But on the other hand, there are strange people who come down here. I mean, right around the corner, there's this friend of mine who I knew from New York named Nick Zed, who's the creator of the Cinema of Transgression, which was like the punk kind of film movement back in the 80s and 90s. And he's a strange case, but he loves Mexico City. He's here. He has a wife and kid. And so, I mean, you still have individuals. And that's what I kind of felt like when I came down here. There was like nobody else really from New York, or very few people from the States, maybe Texas or California. But they were kind of individuals who came down here for different reasons, but were just like kind of felt at home here. And so, I mean, it's always, that's one of the things in everything when you talk about cities, it's always critical mass. When you have just a few people moving around, there's no problem. But when you have a real kind of mass migration, especially of people with budgets, then you have much larger transformations of neighborhoods.
When you were a new face here in Mexico City, were you immediately thinking, I've got to find ways to integrate myself with this place for the long haul? Or how were you thinking about that? Was it a moment-to-moment thing, or were you trying to entrench yourself because you knew this was a place for you?
Yeah, I never have like long-term plans. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow even. So no, it wasn't a conscious thing. It was just that I really felt really happy. I mean, I love cities, and this was a great city to be discovered. It was a great new language that I didn't really know. It was a whole cultural thing. It was a whole political context and all that. So it was like the greatest learning curve of my life. So I was just happy like running around and doing things here. But I mean, I met a woman. We got married soon after. We have 3 kids. It happened step by step without any real planning. And I fell in with a great group of friends and artists who were doing really great stuff with the city. And it was just a good moment when there was no real kind of commercial infrastructure in the art world. And the art world is always kind of the most social world. I mean, now there's tons of galleries and tons of magazines and all that. But back then there was nothing, and at least nothing organized. And so it was like it was a city of opportunity.
You came to Mexico City, were having a good time, and then as a reader will soon read, you got sick. How long did that take before the time of sickness? How long were you here?
I think I was here about 10 years, and I had done all different things and was really just having the time of my life and thinking that life is great and everything. But it was kind of like, obviously it threw a monkey wrench in everything, getting sick. And
you might have gotten sick in Peru, if I have that right. Not even in Mexico City.
Yeah, no, I got sick in Peru with the salmonella parasite. And what somebody said is that I had traveled to Canada before, and by being in a very, very clean environment, that kind of lowered my defenses. And then I went to Peru, and there was parasites that I wasn't really accustomed to. I got, like I said, I had gotten sick in Mexico City countless times, but never any real consequence. So there was different factors. I mean, also I was snorting pure Peruvian cocaine, which kind of like irritates your large intestine, and that also kind of made it more easier for the parasite to kind of...
It's just a perfect storm of factors that all converged to make you sick.
Exactly. I mean, it was, And then when I came back to Mexico, the problem was that nobody really diagnosed it correctly or treated it correctly. In fact, I had got lots of drugs that just worsened it, like cocaine. I mean, all the kind of the kind of bombs that they give you to kill off parasites and worms and stuff like that, which I didn't even have. That stuff really irritates the colon, puts a lot of stress on it, kills off all the kind of gut flora, and allows parasites to flourish. So it was a combination of elements.
How long did you stay incapacitated? When did you return to form?
Well, I was sick for, 5, 6, maybe more years, and I lost like 20 pounds. I'm skinny to begin with, and I lost a lot of weight, and I was just running to the bathroom all the time. So that was definitely putting a kind of made life much more difficult. Yeah, I eventually, after trying all different types of medicine and doctors, found one homeopathic doctor who kind of managed to strengthen my own defenses, and bit by bit I came back, and I'm relatively healthy and don't get sick so often.
Was there a feeling of that you had returned from the brink, or you had gotten a temporary reprieve from death? Tell me about how this increased your death consciousness.
Well, it looked like I was going to die. I mean, I just kept losing weight, and blood just kept flowing out of me, and nobody could really stop it, and it just seemed, well, if it just continues, that's what would happen. And and obviously that kind of chronic illness kind of changed the way you think about yourself and think about the city you live in, and about life in general. And of course there were all the negative aspects, but the positive aspect is that I became completely obsessed with death, and which led me to research it a little bit more, and that opened up a whole new levels of the city that I never really knew, and now that I'm kind of back, I mean, it helped. It just gave me I had been in Mexico City for so many years and thought I really knew it and thought I was really hip and all that, and this really kind of gave a whole new depth to my relation to Mexico, and appreciation of the city. And also hatred of the city.
As you described it, the city you most love and most love to hate, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean...
That's the relationship a lot have with New York, right?
Yeah. I mean, every great city is... the thing is, if you could find the city that you love, then you're really lucky, because most cities, it's just so easy to hate. But... and also the cities that you just love and you don't hate, all the perfectly organized cities in Southern California and Northern California, I mean, they're fine. They're a good place to live and a good place to raise your kids. But if you're interested in culture and really kind of the creation of new kind of culture, I always found, South Bronx, which was the most dangerous place in the world. Salsa, rap, hip-hop, graffiti, all that came out of it, and there's a reason why. The closer you live in proximity to death, the more you have to kind of find ways to survive. And one of my big realizations with this project is that culture is the accumulation of survival strategies. So everything that increases the probability or possibility of you to survive is good. So music, dance, food, neighborhoods, all those things are created because religion, they're all created and they all exist and they all keep transforming and evolving because they help people survive. So the toughest neighborhoods are the ones that need the most help, and the people create their own culture. And that's the whole, for me, the difference between global culture, which is a consumer thing, which people already at a certain level, socioeconomic level, can consume that which they need, but that means that they are not producing it, they're not creating it. The poorer people don't have that option, and therefore they have to create their own things. And so in Mexico City, you have all these people. You have medicines that are being created with. You have all these magical kind of powders and candles, and you have these new religions, and you have all these things which are constantly being changed and evolved to treat specific problems in specific places. And that's, for me, where that's culture, and you don't find that in nice, safe cities. And Mexico City is becoming a nice, safe city, and it's losing its own culture.
It ties in with one of the most fascinating themes I found in your book, which is the idea that if you want to survive in a city, any city, you've got to become part of its ecosystem as soon as you can, whether, broadly speaking, whether that's cultural or literally biological. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole thing about adapting. And I ask the question, why adapt? Why adapt to a certain culture? Well, if you don't speak the language well, it's stressful. You can't communicate yourself, you can't communicate what you want as well. You don't get what you want. So just even speaking the language is very important. You have to adapt your vocal cords and your expressions and the way that you perceive the world in linguistical terms in order to lower the stress and to be able to get more what you want. Biologically, you have to, we all create our own gut flora by eating dirt or whatever as when we're kids. It's all the bacteria and parasites that we eat when we're the youngest that colonize our large intestine and grow into the civilizations that become our own defense mechanisms and help us. So you have to adapt to the local ones. And if you're adapted to a local bacteria culture and you go somewhere else, that's when you have problems. When you travel is when you get sick and all that. That's what happened to me in Peru and all that. So the more time you spend in a place, the more you kind of come to terms with the local flora and fauna, the microflora and fauna and the macros.
And in the book you describe the way you eat today, which is different than the way you ate before you got sick. But you describe the foods you eat, the nopal and the huitlacoche, the kind of foods that I love eating in Los Angeles. So you had to look a bit farther back in time for those foods, right? You have to go to the foods that are really true to this place, no?
Exactly. I mean, one of the interesting things that I didn't really know much about was coevolution, how all organisms co-evolve, sometimes with other organisms, but they all have evolved and are constantly interacting with bacteria. When we eat raw vegetables and fruit, those plants and organisms give us their bacteria, or at least their defenses, which are bacteria against parasites and all that. So all the native plants provide us with the defenses that they've developed over millions of years to deal with parasites. So eating local isn't just a political, economic, or even a taste kind of thing. It is very much a health and medical. I mean, preventive medicine is all about adapting, not having stress, not having problems with the local parasites and everything. And eating the local food is the best way to do that.
I dare say that somebody considering visiting Mexico City, reading at least the first few chapters of your book, might reconsider it, because you describe it in a way that You think you literally say Mexico City is every day killing you in a variety of ways. Do you actually wake up every morning thinking, here we go, I'm about to get partially killed by this city in so many ways, one more day, what's going to get me? Do you actually think that, or is that just sometimes the way you think?
Well, the first 10 years I was here, I never thought like that, and the last few years I haven't thought like that. But when I was very sick, I mean, everything I ate just, as I say, just turned to shit in my system. And just kind of made me all the sicker. So it was really hard to be optimistic about going to eat out or even just walking around. I mean, the pollution and the dog days of pollution and all that, it was a present kind of clear and present danger or something. So yeah, no, I took it personally for a long time. Although Mexico City didn't make me sick, it was the thing that kept me sick and aggravated my illness. But what's interesting now is it's the cleaner, healthier kind of culture that's being sold that is actually killing people. I mean, a lot of people prefer buying things in a supermarket that are sealed in plastic, thinking that those are healthier and better and they won't get sick. But in fact, people, like I said, die here from heart disease and diabetes and circulatory diseases, and that's all from the junk that's in the industrial processed food from the U.S. that comes nicely packaged and all that.
Most obese nation in the world, as I think you said in the book.
Yeah, Mexico, I think, just beat the U.S. and obesity and childhood obesity and all that, and that's directly tied to the imports of U.S. junk food. I mean, and there's nothing else. It's Coca-Cola and all the snack foods and just garbage. All the pizza and everything else that's come. So on the one hand, the skies are cleaner and everything's nicer, but on the other hand, it's not. I mean, the levels, car imports continue to grow. I mean, the amount of cars in the city and although the ozone and the lead has been taken out of the gasoline, there's still all the microparticles, and so there's an image of Mexico City that it's cleaner and healthier now, and in part because it's a global city and it's cleaned up its act. But on the other hand, no, that's really what's killing people much more and provoking much more disease, which obviously helps sell all the drugs sold by the pharmaceutical companies who are here big time and promoting their own and selling shit that they don't sell in the States or Europe anymore. I mean, they get away with a lot more. There's a lot less control. You could buy antibiotics over the counter, and people self-medicate themselves all the time. And doctors push antibiotics on people every single time they go and have a sore throat or anything. So I mean, it's the clean, modern, healthy kind of products that are actually killing people.
There is some sense then that Mexico City seems to have come back from the brink of death, as you yourself have, but in reality, the situation is at least complicated. But do you think there's been a net loss overall in the prospects for this city, despite the improvements that have been made?
Well, there's always drawbacks to progress and all that, and now Mexico City is on the map as a tourist destination, a safe tourist destination, as a clean city, as all that. But encouraging tourism basically my biggest bitch about what's happened to modernize and clean up the city is that they've run the working class and the industrial culture out of the city. So just like in the Lower East Side was cleaned up and made into a trendy kind of gallery restaurant mecca because they ran the Puerto Ricans, working class Puerto Ricans, out of the neighborhood. They used drugs as an excuse, as they use here pollution and other things, as an excuse to remake the city in the way they want. And the historic center of here in Mexico City has been completely revamped, using pirated goods and illegal drug activities as the excuse to go in and completely. They got rid of rent control, and they ran all the working class people out of the neighborhood, and Carlos Slim, the wealthiest man in the world, bought up huge tracts within the center, and he's the one who's behind all the improvements, which is just transforming into a tourist destination to an artsy kind of neighborhood where the rents are high. And I mean, it's a very obvious. Here it was a single player who really transformed the neighborhood. In New York, it was a combination of real estate and banks and political things that completely transformed the Lower East Side.
What strategies do you have then for searching out the strongholds of culture that remain, of whatever class you can find it? Where do you don't even have to reveal where they are if you'd rather not have people know, but how do you look for them?
Well, actually, it's a good question, and there's a simple answer, which is you take the metro. You take the metro outside of the center of the city, but also all the metro stops. Around all the metro stops, there's always everybody selling all the pirated goods, and there's all these always a small economy because of the flow of people. There's always a small economy located right around the exit or entrance of the metro station. So that's always a good kind of thing. Then you go to the most traditional markets that have been around for a long time, and because there's a lot of money moving around, you always have a lot of you have symbiotic kind of economies around there. So you have prostitution, you have pulquerias, cantinas, you have all this sort of stuff. So any kind of traditional places where money moves, or there's just a mass of people, working class people, you'll have a lot of economic activity, but it's kind of local or pirated economic activity that I don't know. I mean, it just seems that there are nodes of interesting culture at those places.
I agree completely. It's something I don't see in any other city of the world. The way that the metro, though, I mean, it is vast, but it's also its own city in a way. You're in another city when you're on the metro, and I find it a fascinating work of design in itself. But it's also, you could say there is a culture that thrives along it and is in some sense supported by it.
Yeah, I mean, I said it was outside the stations. Inside the stations, there's huge stations. I mean, huge stations with like mini cities inside there.
Like a mile to your connection sometimes.
Exactly, and they have tons and tons of stores or just people selling stuff right in the middle of things. And I was doing a series on Mexican beauty to show how toxic and kind of harmful all the beauty transformations of women in order to go from Indian bodies and faces to European or American kind of. But I mean, there's all these beauty salons inside the metro stations, and of course they're tiny little things with no budget, but they're the coolest little places. And I mean, so the metro is a world unto itself. I mean, it's been around for 40 years, and it's I love it. It's cheap, efficient, great. But I mean, within it, there's all these microeconomies.
Right, yeah, I can't wait to get back riding it on this trip. But you mentioned the pulqueria, the vanishing business establishment that's selling a vanishing kind of agave liquor. Why are these important to you? Anybody reading this book will know that they are. There's even photos of pulquerias in the middle of the book. What are they to you?
Well, those are also nodes of culture. There's a lot of things going on there. One is there's a drink that's been drunk within this valley, the Mexico City Valley, for thousands of years, and is really only available, or has only been drunk within a small radius around the city. So it's a very local culture, and it was involved in all the religious and all the even sex and war ceremonies. It was the basis of a whole culture. There are the pulque gods, and there's all these ceremonies. So it's a long-standing part of the local culture. In Mexico, it was the drink of. Originally it was drink of the gods and the kings and all that, and then it's been going down since, and it became kind of like the bottom of the barrel drink for several decades or centuries, when the beer industry wanted to cast it as dirty and cured with shit and all that, but which kind of drove it kind of underground, but it's basically a working class drink or something. Now in this neighborhood and a couple others, there's kind of new places that are opening up that are kind of making it trendy.
Trendy pulquerias, wow. Yeah.
And I guess that pulque is as bad as the other pulque because you can't really get fresh pulque within the city. It just doesn't. You have to get it right from the source or something like that for it to be really fresh. But pulque also is one of these things it was medicine. It's called agua viva, which is living water or life water, because it is completely full of bacteria. It's a culture of bacteria, and it helps stabilize people's gut flora and defenses. So it's involved in everything. But the city itself, I love all the traditional kind of working class places, and Polkadeas are definitely the lower end of them, and they have a great culture. You go there and, people talk. One guy who was like middle class said, well, I go here all the time because it's so cheap, I can invite everybody. So it's like the most social kind of thing in the world, where you could just go and talk to anybody, and it's really, I like, billiard halls also, and that's also like a real working class kind of thing, and they've been around for the longest time, and they're like the coolest kind of places for me. So pulquerias have been disappearing. They've been closing down. There's only 50 now. There used to be hundreds and all that, but they're also at the same time kind of being trendy, just like mezcal has kind of been picked up, become trendy. Pulque is like the next thing, but it's the most local kind of cultural product and process, and it's been around forever. So that's the other thing. You find things that have been around for a long, long time, and you just follow them to their sources, and you find amazing people who are still doing it in amazing communities who have long tradition.
I can imagine if I asked Mexicans, should I go to a pulqueria, they might advise me against it in many cases. And similarly, the Mercado Sonora, when I was trying to find it last time I was here, I kept getting told, don't go there. You don't want to go there. It's too dangerous. It's full of, they sell lion cubs there. You don't want to go. I eventually just went and found amazing things there. And you've done a photo book on this market. What's impressive to you about it? There's many obvious ways. What's less obvious? It is a vast market. It is dense. Who knows what they are selling in some of those corners,
Yeah, the Sonora market is another node of culture. It sells, like you said, animals, legal and illegal, and it sells toys, and it sells herbs. The herbs, of course, a basis of medicine. More people go to informal doctors than they go to formal doctors here. And herbs, which have been around for thousands of years, and these people who herb doctors haven't kind of experienced it, passed down from whatever. So that's a real great thing. And then you have all the magic products, which are kind of industrially produced. Well, they're made by hand, but they're photocopied and they're like printed, and so it has an industrial aesthetic. And that was one of the things about Mexico City, is that the working class industrial graphics are amongst the greatest in the world, and you find these on these magic products, and the products themselves, the ingredients are unimportant, or who knows what they are, as you say. What's important is the effect that it causes on the person, the hope that it gives them, and these industrial graphics are incredible, and they do a lot of the work. So you have, for me, the interesting thing is the graphic visual stuff, but also the combination of people in need and these people who create kind of products that give people hope, lower their stress, and help them survive. But in answer to another thing, like you said, that the Sonora market people said not to go to and all that, that's another rule of thumb in cities all over the world. Anytime people say don't go there, anytime there's danger associated with the place, you know that's where the greatest local culture is going on.
You look for the danger because, for the reasons you've explained, that's where the survival strategies have developed. That's where the culture is, because culture is survival.
Exactly. You don't go there because it's exciting and you risk death. You go there because real danger. The real danger is like health conditions and economic disenfranchisement and all this sort of stuff. And so when you have like gangs in a place, well, that's a community that's still resisting terrorism, resisting globalization, and the danger that these neighborhoods create is its own part of its own defenses, and that means it is still resisting and it's still creating its own culture, and that's so it's a good indication of that there's still activity going on there.
Other than from disease and from the ever-present threat of cars that go where they want to go, do you ever feel in harm's way here in Mexico City?
No, really no. No. I mean, the thing is, look, if you have healthy defenses, if you're in good shape and all that, you don't have to worry about anything. I had no defenses, and I was an open wound for a long time, and therefore there was a particular relationship I had with the city where I was at risk. Like babies, old people here, they're at risk. Indians who come from outside of the city and don't know how to deal with cars are at risk. So it's like the adapting and all that. But if you have a healthy system and if you know how to get around cities, this is like the safest, sweetest city in the world. And it's not safe in the New York way where you have cops everywhere. It's safe because of the communities and because the people don't go out of it. There's not gratuitous violence here. It's not, the levels of stress are not like in New York where people or in the States, people just explode and start killing each other or just have to like fuck over other people because the disparities between their situation and other people's. People here are, they don't live in harmony. Nobody lives in harmony in a city, but there are cultural strategies, which is people being very nice and formal to each other. Just a formal address where people always say hi to each other when they come into place, where they just recognize each other. There's just a lot more social contact. And by having the formal kind of basic social interactions, you lower stress and you lower kind of like, in New York, everyone's scared and paranoid of everyone else, and that creates a lot of kind of aggression and all that sort of stuff. Here, people are constantly diffusing the aggression by social conventions and strategies.
You've looked at this city through many photographs, through a motion picture, you've done business here. What has it done to your relationship with this city or your consciousness of the city to write this book, to take a long-form textual examination of the city and your life in it? How has that changed things for you, if at all, here? Or does it simply reflect your existence here?
It's a tough one. Because I began writing it when I was sick. I began writing it when I really hated the city. And even throughout, I hated the city, the transformations going on. It was cathartic. I definitely got a lot of the literally shit out of me. I mean, the bad shit out. What remains to be seen is the reception of Mexicans to it, because, I mean, having a gringo talk about local culture, and I go back to the earliest kind of culture, and I portray it. I focus on death and sometimes gruesome kind of death, and so I mean how it will be received here when it's translated will be an interesting thing. I'm sure a lot of people will have knee-jerk responses and will just kind of hate it and get pissed off at me. Is
there a tradition of disliking that when a gringo's book is translated? Oh, forget it, they don't know.
Well, yeah, not just books. I mean, everything. There's all, there's local mafias, local cultural mafias here who don't want anyone to I mean, they're the experts, so they're the ones who should talk about it, and it's particularly annoying when it's a gringo who's doing that, and especially when he's criticizing every single political institution and every single medical institution and I have no respect for anything really, so it's not,
the locals don't like the politicians very much. The people, the natives, they don't like the institutions. They don't love those institutions, right?
Well, it's a funny thing. Mexicans are nationalistic, of course. They won't, and their nationalism is determined in large part is based on hatred for gringos, because gringos are the colonizers, the imperialists, and it used to be based on hatred for Europeans, or love for, by the way. So, there's a real kind of, to begin with, there's a real kind of reaction against any kind of outside kind of views or anything. But if you ask them, of course they hate all their fucking political institutions, and they hate they know all the politicians are corrupt. So their nationalism it's Well, like in the States, I mean, you get it into the kids early. I mean, the flag and the Patriots and the grand history and all that. And so everybody's very nationalistic. Nobody here burns flags like we do in the States. But yeah, no, if you start like analyzing it, of course they hate everything as much as I do. They hate the fucking traffic. They hate the corrupt officials. They hate a lot of things. But in general, it'll be interesting to see the reaction from somebody outside hating their beloved city.
I would imagine you've had Mexican friends read the English language version. Have they said anything like watch out for the reaction to this?
Yeah, they said you're definitely going to get criticized. And I mean, what I do is it's not an academic work, so it's not like there's an interesting kind of cultural legacy here, which is everything you write, especially in like novels or anything like that, you have to dedicate it to the guy who helped you get it published, which is your like mentor. So in the States, there's like a real generation kind of warfare where you always hate the people who come before you, always shit on them. Here, you always pay your respects to. It's a real pyramidal culture. Everything is done, which is another social strategy, a survival strategy where, of course, you're nice to the people who could help you because that way you stay alive. In the States, everybody spits on their elders because they feel that they could make a living for themselves. Here, it's much more difficult. So you really have to. And there's only like, in the cultural world, there's only like a couple players, the big ones who you have to like suck up to in order to get where you're going. So there is no kind of like dedications to like local things. I don't cite any of the works that I do. I kind of create a kind of my own kind of narrative of Mexican history. And of course they're going to be, I mean, I'm sure I make lots of mistakes, but everything is based on material that I found. And often I choose more lurid and kind of descriptions and histories, but they're all part of the culture. So I really pieced it together from the culture here, but because there's no footnotes or citations of historians or others, they'll get pissed about that. And they'll get pissed that I don't really talk about anyone else, like a photographer and an artist, and a couple things I say, and a couple positive things, but mostly I talk about the negative aspect because, I'm kind of critical of like whole classes, like the upper classes. So that could be problematic. So yeah, I expect some interesting reactions.
To be fair though, you're upfront about it. You say in the book, when the figures don't agree, I go with the most dramatic. And that seems like the Mexico City way to do it. That fits in with it. Pick the dramatic story. Go with it.
There's a whole tradition here of something called nota roja, which is red news or something, but it's sensationalist. I mean, sensationalism is definitely a part of the culture in all the newspapers and magazines, and I love it. I think it's a great part of the culture. So academics here are great. I mean, so they're some of the best thinkers and most rigorous kind of researchers and all that. But it's more fun to get off the academic path and just kind of sling things around and not worry about truth, because what is truth? I mean, like I say, for instance, the numbers vary so much. The figures for the population of Mexico City, the margin of error is the size of small American cities. The number of people killed during the conquest, well, that's millions and millions of differences. So I mean, basically, I just kind of use the fact that there's no truth in the world, that there is less truth in history, that there's less truth in Mexican history, and especially in Mexican history about death. And I use it to kind of create my own narrative and to create something which I openly admit is from a paranoid kind of perspective of someone who felt that they were dying. So really, nobody should use me for like policy papers or for anything like that. They
should read it to be entertained. I've been speaking here on Colonia Condesa with Kurt Hollander, filmmaker, photographer, writer, longtime resident of Mexico City, and more, author of Several Ways to Die in Mexico City. Kurt, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Licky, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Millman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.